I work for the US think tank, the Rocky Mountain Institute. It was set up about 40 years ago by Amory Lovins. It works all over the world to drive the energy transition. And I have, as George mentioned, a background as a financial market strategist. And this is an unashamedly finance pitch, I'm afraid. And I'm a fellow investor in the WHEB fund. So I feel your pain that the performance of renewable stocks is miserable in the last 2 years. And I guess I'm here to tell you to stick with the theme, because this remains one of the great growth opportunities of our time. It made no sense to sell out of the internet story in 2001, 2002, and in the same way it makes no sense to abandon the renewable revolution after it's been whacked by rising interest rates. So there are 4 things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what is the global story. Then I'll talk about why we can be confident that change will happen. Then I'll think about timing, which of course matters most of all to us in finance, and then conclude with what should we do. So on this first slide, to set the scene, we just had the hottest year in recorded human history. I hardly need to say this, but fossil fuels that provide the energy upon which we all live and operate have reached the limits of their growth. It's not, in fact, just carbon, which this slide is trying to show that we're kind of running out of our carbon budget incredibly quickly. To put some numbers on that, I mean, if we're burning 40 gigatons a year and we've got a 300 gigaton budget for 1.5, it's not very far, right? It's obvious. But it's not just carbon and global warming. It's also the fact that fossil fuels waste 2/3 of their energy. They pour pollution into our streets and homes. They kill millions of people, 7 million actually, according to the World Health Organization, every single year. And they use 15,000 million tons of stuff every year, pouring pollution into our streets and into our water and into nature. So we need a better solution. We need it quite quickly. And it is, in fact, the search for a better solution that drives the very financial opportunity I'm going to describe next. The solution to this limits to growth of fossil fuels is renewables. We now have a superior energy source, one which enables us to have a dramatic increase in our energy usage and at much lower cost. So at heart, what we've done, we've figured out how to harvest directly the power of the sun through wind and solar and store it in batteries and hydrogen. And our brilliant scientists and entrepreneurs have figured out how to make these technologies small and modular and get them onto learning curves whereby their costs fall by around 20% for every doubling of capacity. So as a result of that, solar and wind, batteries and all this stuff on this slide, you can see they're in the zone where they can start to outcompete fossil fuels on price. What that has also done, it's unlocked a huge resource. These technologies, they're huge, they're local, they're universal. If my slides were working, I would have a nice map of the world here, but no, it doesn't matter. Even if you constrain massively where we can put solar and wind, we can still capture around 7,000 petawatt hours a year, which is 100 times more than we use for all of our current energy. What that means is that we need less than 1% of our land to provide us with all of our energy. Don't fall for the fossil fuel propaganda that we can't do this thing. We certainly can do this thing. And to give you a couple of numbers to make it come alive, a single solar panel replaces 10 tons of coal over its lifetime. You put it on your roof, that's 10 tons of coal. A single battery, one of those batteries you can carry, bike battery, about 1 kilowatt hour, will replace 2 barrels of oil over its lifetime. So these technologies, they're far superior, they're leaner. And then this slide is showing that they're growing exponentially. So you see wind and solar, electric vehicles, battery storage, all these extraordinary exponential growth curves which are going on right now, which, as George kindly said, I spotted it's about 10 years ago actually now, the start of this exponential, and on it goes. Solar generation has been doubling every 2 to 3 years. This year we're on track to install 400 gigawatts. Again, what is 400 gigawatts? Well, I'll tell you, 400 gigawatts is enough to put up 1 gigawatt every single day, obviously, but it's also enough solar to supply us with all of the growth in electricity that we require this year, more or less, all of it from one technology in 1 year, and on it grows. Electric vehicle and battery sales have been doubling nearly every year. By the end of this year, as Alok mentioned, there'll be 20% of global sales, but there'll actually be 40% of sales in China, the world's biggest car market, which is on track for 90% of sales by the end of this decade. Furthermore, this change is happening across the world. So people often say to me, it's not happening in this country or that country. But basically, where you have decent government, well, I resist the temptation to poke anyone in this country, of course. We have decent government who can actually put stuff up and solve problems, then this stuff gets built incredibly quickly. So from Chile to Vietnam to India to Morocco, governments and companies are seizing on the new technology to get energy which is ultimately local, cheap and fast to deploy. Next slide, please. And this is big enough to reshape the energy system. So people often say to me, and I sort of make a presentation like this, and they'll say, yeah, fine, but you're only talking about electricity, that's only 20% of final energy demand. Actually, it's a third of fossil fuel demand, which is the issue or the problem. And we, of course, now have solutions right across the fossil fuel space. So for electricity, we have it for light transportation with electric vehicles. We have it for home heating and low temperature heat with heat pumps. And then we have this kind of problem at the end of petchem and flying and cement that the fossil fuel apologist Václav Smil talks about in one of his innumerable books. It's only the last 20%, folks. The last 20% is not a ceiling to the growth today. So this is where we're heading. It's a kind of typical technology shift from state A to state B, to make it the most simple terms. So from a system dominated by coal, oil, and gas to a system dominated by solar and wind. And change is kind of sweeping in a vast, unstoppable tide. So we're electrifying our light transportation and low temperature heat systems. We're decarbonizing our electricity systems at extraordinary speed. We're figuring out how to deploy hydrogen in the rest. And it's a little bit like the rise of the internet or the industrial revolution. It's kind of unstoppable tide. And this is a shift that we've seen many times. And I guess this is, I didn't mention that I actually trained as a historian before I became a finance person. But this is a story we've seen so many times. And one of the reasons why it's such a shock to the current people running the fossil fuel system is that they have no sense of historical change. They've only ever dealt with ever-rising demand for fossil fuels. Well, guys, this has happened many times before. Before cars, we had horses. Before gas lighting, we had before electric lighting, we had gas lighting. And before steamships, we had sailing ships. So the point simply is that technology shifts happen all the time, and they often happen in this kind of X-shaped pattern where the old stuff falls as the new one rises. Next slide, please. So this is a story, and with all due respect to myself, I made this argument a few times, and it's kind of happening. But the real question that we always get asked is, okay, great, but can we be confident of success? There are many barriers to change: variability, minerals, inertia, grids, permitting, the power of the fossil fuel incumbency, petrostates. The list is very, very long of barriers to change. And we spend most of our time at the Rocky Mountain Institute trying to figure out how to solve these barriers to change. But the key point is that the solutions outweigh the challenges. And the most credible assumption must be that we continue to solve them. So I'm going to run through 4 or 5 core, powerful drivers of change and then think what it means. So let me start with cost. So this it might seem to you a slightly kind of obvious chart, as we specialize, I guess, in obvious charts. But let me start with cost. Doyne Farmer at Oxford has shown that costs are on learning curves persist. And what that means is that costs will continue to fall over time. So the chart on the left is solar, the cost of solar in dollars per megawatt hour. And it was described by Fatih Birol at the International Energy Agency a couple of years ago as the cheapest energy source in history at around $40 per megawatt hour. We had a little bump last year, but the costs have started to fall again, very quickly actually. And you can now project forward. It's going to get to around $20 to $30 by the end of this decade. That's kind of reasonable consensus view. So the cheapest energy source in history is going to halve in price by the end of this decade. Just think what that does. It's not in people's models. The other core technology, which once more is also falling in price, and in fact we got the latest data out 2 days ago from BNEF, is batteries. So batteries, what do? They take this eternal solar energy and they store it for you. And therefore they are the other absolutely core building block of the energy transition. And they got to around $150, bumped up a bit, and now they're falling again. And they'll be between $60 and $90 per kilowatt of capacity by the end of this decade. So again, the two core technologies are on these extraordinary cost learning curves. The second absolutely core driver, which might surprise you, actually wouldn't surprise this room, I guess, but surprises my green friends, is capitalism itself. And the fossil fuel system generates rents of $2,000 billion a year. That's all that free money that they get for digging oil out of the ground for $10 and selling it for $100 to you. And they spend it on important things like pointy missiles and invading their neighbors and taking over international conferences and all the rest of the stuff they spend the money on. That's what we have got to aim at, right? It's an enormous amount of money that the entrepreneurs of the renewable system can take for themselves. And as a result, it inspires people in every niche of the energy system to find solutions and get a piece of that rent. So when people say to me, this problem can't be solved, the answer is this: this problem can't be solved in a specific location at a specific time. Do you really think that the combined talents of 8,000 million people, the lure of $2,000 billion a year, and the race for leadership is going to stop change? The third overarching driver is energy security. So you remember when Putin's invaded Ukraine, this illegal and appalling invasion of Ukraine a couple of years ago, and the fossil fuel folks said, oh, that means that we have to have more fossil fuels. Actually, no. A limited number of people have fossil fuels, but everybody has renewables. Well, everyone apart from Singapore, I should say. Everyone has got renewables, and in enormous size. It's 100 times greater than our current use, as I already mentioned. And that means that the energy trilemma has been solved. The Gordian knot has been cut. We have enough renewables. They're cheaper, they're cleaner, they're faster to deploy, and they provide us with energy security. Next slide, please. The sort of fourth Uber driver is what has almost been unleashed by Putin. It's this race for the top between China, European Union, US, for primacy in the energy technologies of the future. Governments are getting behind change, with all due respect to Sir Alok, not just to save the planet, but in order to dominate the industries of the future. Well, as you said, actually. It's a race that China was winning until the passage of the IRA. And this year, for example, China will install 200 gigawatts of solar, which is more than the US or the European Union have installed in 30 years, in 1 year, in one country. And that race for leadership is now sparking change in and of itself, as people are seeing Chinese dominance trying to catch up. And the final point just came to me with the sort of final Uber point, I guess, came to me from the International Energy Agency report that came out 3 or 4 weeks ago, which looked at the cost of the fossil fuel system and the renewable system. So people are always saying, renewable system, we'd love to do it, but it's too expensive. It can't be done. And what they do, they then say, well, the capital cost of building the solar and the wind is quite high. That's cherry picking, folks. We're finance people. You don't just look at the capital cost, you look at the operating cost too. And the IEA did the calculation. The fossil fuel capital cost per annum is $1 trillion. But we consumers spend $8 trillion buying the fossil fuels. It's 8 times bigger. And a large chunk of that, $2 trillion, is going to spend on rent. So the point simply is you have to look at all of the costs of business as usual versus all of the costs of renewable system. The IEA did the numbers, and they worked out that it was $12 trillion cheaper to build a renewable system. And that leads us to the extraordinary conclusion that it's actually cheaper to save the planet than to destroy it, as well as saving the planet. So what does all this stuff mean? Well, it means that policy action will keep rising. So again, I often run across folks who say to me, oh, we're not going to do this thing because the worst example of this, incidentally, is the energy EIA in the United States. They do these kind of fake forecasts about the future, which assume that there is no policy change. But policymakers are very clever, as we've just seen, and they spot opportunities, and they change over time. So as the maths gets better, as the economics gets better, as the pressure rises, policymakers too change. So we have the wonderful example of the net zero targets rising over time, combustion car bans rising over time, carbon taxes rising over time. Inevitably, we can't focus and we can't calculate or forecast the detail, but we do know that the policy pressure is going to rise over time. the kind of false profits which are being made by the fossil fuel sector will not last forever. And it's not just policy, it's also innovation. Innovation is pouring into this space. The falling costs has kind of unleashed a tsunami of innovation in solar and wind and batteries. As I mentioned, the learning curves are undeniable. The learning curves, incidentally, is thousands of individual entrepreneurs all over the world figuring out how to do stuff better. Solar panels are getting more efficient, they're getting cheaper, batteries are getting denser and cheaper, and they're spreading to more and more sectors in a kind of domino effect from one sector to the next. And now innovation is actually spreading to every corner of the energy system. So in the heavy transport system, you've got electric ferries, electric planes. Not everyone's a believer, I personally am, but anyway, there's all kinds of innovation going on there. In the industrial sector, we're getting heat batteries, we're getting industrial heat pumps. There's innovation going on everywhere. And the third consequence of this is capital is moving. And I kind of want to dwell on this for a moment because it's not always appreciated, even by people in financial markets, that money's already shifting. Peak fossil fuel capex was 2014 at around 1.2, 1.4, I thought it was, anyway, $1.2 trillion. It's now already sunk to $1 trillion. And in the meantime, renewable CapEx has gone from $1 trillion to 1.8. So it's now renewable CapEx, at least according to IEA numbers, which one can slightly debate. But anyway, it's already outspending fossil fuels by around 2 to 1. And the final point I want to make in this kind of section is that the challenges are many, but the solutions are more. And change is hard. There are many people, many companies that WHEB has been investing in who are fighting to make change happen. I'm not suggesting for a second this is easy. There are many challenges to win, but I'm here to say you will win. The solution's greater, and I want to illustrate this point with variability. So one of the favorite arguments of the fossil fuel folks is that the sun doesn't shine at night. They have this wonderful argument, the sun doesn't shine at night, gee, who knew? And they go, the sun doesn't shine at night, therefore you're wrong. Well, guess what? It shines in the morning. And it shines every morning, and it shines in the morning very, very predictably. And once you have batteries, you can capture that solar light during the day, and then you use it for the moments it's not shining, and then the next morning you wake up and you fill your battery again. So the point simply is that we have solutions to this issue of variability. And the IEA, again, has done the calculations. They work out the sort of the short-term storage issues, which at the moment we're solving with peaker plants and hydro, and in the long term we're going to solve with two additional solutions, one of which is batteries, the other of which is demand-side management, where basically you switch stuff off when you don't need it. And then they've also figured out interseasonal solutions. So the point to me is that even variability, which seemed a couple of years ago to be the most intractable problem facing us, has also got solutions. There's just two final sections to talk about. One is timing. So this is all great, but we're finance people, it's like, fine, whatever, but when does it happen? When do we make the money? So let me talk about what is special about this decade. What will happen by 2030? This is the decade that the capacity gets built to enable the entire renewable revolution to happen. It's this decade. We build the machines to make the machines. Solar manufacturing today, as I mentioned, is 400 gigawatt of capacity. It will be 1,000 gigawatts a year by the end of this decade. Actually, they've already built the capacity. Demand will be at around 1,000 by the end of this decade. We have enough capacity at the moment, or we're producing about 1,000 gigawatt hours a year of batteries. By the end of this decade, it will be 10,000. You look right across the renewable system, and people are chasing this opportunity. I should say, as an aside, it's terribly shameful that in the United Kingdom, the pioneer of the Industrial Revolution, we have one battery factory coming, one out of 400 globally. 1 in 400 is just shameful. Anyway, but capacity is getting built right across the world. Renewables are racing up S-curves. This is the decade that they're racing up the S-curve. So if you look at solar wind, as Sir Alok mentioned, solar wind's already 80% of, or renewables are already 80% of new electricity generation capacity. By the end of this decade, it's basically going to be all of it. Really very little dispute about that. Similar story in the electric vehicle space. We're going to go from around 20% sales today to around between 60 and 80% by the end of the decade. Moreover, key sectors will start hitting their tipping points this decade. There's been a long debate, we can't solve this in steel or cement or ammonia or whatever it is, we haven't got enough stuff. But guess what? This is the decade we hit the price tipping points. You get a price tipping point first, then you get the volume being built out. And even in the hard-to-abate sectors like ammonia or steel or shipping, there are very, very clear solutions starting to materialize. And we think by 2030, they too will hit their tipping point. And what that means is that fossil fuel demand faces either decline or collapse. And that will be absolutely clear by the end of the decade. The kind of pattern for this technology is pretty clear, and I mentioned it right up front in my kind of X-shaped patterns. You get a peak, you get a plateau for 5 to 10 years, and then you get decline as new solutions come in and take all of the growth. So fossil fuel demand from our calculations hit a peak in 2019. 4 years ago, we're now bouncing along plateaus, so the fact that we are 1 or 2% higher than we were in 2019 is merely a bump on a plateau. It doesn't really take away from the fact we kind of on a peak. You can see the story actually incidentally with coal. Look at it. Hits a peak in 2014, plateaus for about 10 years, hits another tiny peak last year, and then down it goes. And it looks incidentally like Chinese fossil fuel demand in the electricity sector, the world's largest area, of a single area of demand. It looks like that has hit a peak, and it's hit a peak because China's building 200 gigawatts of solar and 60 gigawatts of wind this year. That's why fossil fuel demand is peaking. And then finally, it means that the debate will be very different in 2030. And again, this is, I think, is our luxury for me as a strategist, is you can kind of look forward 5 or 6 years. And at the moment, you have this debate with, will it work, won't it work? Are renewables better, are they worse, are they more expensive? Maybe if you add in special costs, they look a bit more expensive, all the rest of it. By 2030, this debate will be over. I won't need to stand up on this stage. Everyone will know all this stuff. It'll be absolutely clear. So that's, I guess, why we need to be investing in these companies now. Which brings me to my final section. So what do we need to do? How do we make money out of this shift? And I wanted to summarize the entire energy transition in a single slide for George. He quite likes this, apparently. And everywhere is different, but there are actually 4 things that we need to do, and therefore 4 buckets of companies to chase after. We have to improve our efficiency. So this COP doubling of efficiency goal, for example, from 2% to 4%. Anyone who's doing efficiency, great place to be. We have to decarbonize our electricity system. Again, the other COP goal of tripling renewables by 2030 is just about within reach. But we have to decarbonize our electricity. That's that vertical there. We have to decarbonize our electrons. Then we have to shift to the right. We have to electrify everything. So we already talked a lot about the transport sector, which is a very big part of the puzzle, but we have to electrify everything. And then we have that sort of final bucket where we don't quite know what to do yet, where the answer, I suspect, will be green hydrogen. The other thing we need to be clear about is to avoid temporary solutions. So gas as a transition fuel is a temporary solution. Carbon capture and storage, as the IEA again pointed out, is a tool of continuity. It is a temporary solution. Hydrogen-based heating, another fake solution. Biomass for energy, also a fake solution, which again, the people might want to think a little bit about. Anyway, they're all temporary solutions. They will fail. The whole enormous fossil fuel system has to shrink down into that tiny box on the right by 2050, and then it has to vanish altogether. So just think about what that means in investment terms. Third thing we have to do is we have to build out the new. This is a fabulous growth opportunity. By the end of this decade, solar cells are going to quadruple. Battery sales will rise 6 to 10-fold. Heat pump sales will triple. An entire green hydrogen industry needs to get built. So there's an enormous amount of growth. And it's not just, again, you won't necessarily fall into the trap of buying the solar panel companies because you don't make any money doing that. You want to buy the companies around the edge, the facilitators, the people who make the shovels, as it were. So we have to build out the new, and we have to build out all the infrastructure around the new. And what does this mean then for investors? Well, this is absolutely classic, I would suggest, example of, if this is a mega theme like the industrialization of China or the internet, the kind of four tools you reach for in your toolbox. It depends where you are in the chain. So the first thing to do is what you folks, I guess, have been doing very wisely, allocating capital to growth sectors. and finding good fund managers who can actually find the right opportunities like WHEB. The second thing to do is to exit sectors in decline. I mean, if one remembers anything, it's Warren Buffett's famous aphorism that it's much easier to shoot the horse than buy the car. It's very hard, of course, to buy the right car company in 1910. It's very easy to know that all the horse companies are going to go bust. So you want to exit sectors in decline. The third, if you're more aggressive, you want to, if you're a hedge fund, I think you want to go long short winners and losers from the change. And this here, again, I think is a fabulous opportunity which will materialize this decade, is that you're going to get hedge funds going long short, those who are paying lip service and greenwashing versus other companies who are actually doing the real thing. And that should be a lot of money to be made from that. And then finally, we want to be picking winners. This is the Gartner hype cycle, and you want to pick winners. You want to be very cognizant of when markets are overbought, and the hydrogen possibly got a little bit too excited and all the rest of it. But it is a series of Gartner hype cycles happening right across the renewable energy system. So let me conclude with the observation that I'd like you all, if you would, to keep faith in the story in the face of this downturn, because this is the future. Thank you.
Given those cost curves that you put up on the slides, which are making it very clear how renewables in most circumstances are already cheaper than many fossil fuels, why does anyone build a coal plant today?
Well, very few people are. Is part of the answer to that. I mean, the only coal plants that are getting built at scale are in China, and the Chinese are not building them in order to burn more coal. They're building them as backup to their renewable system. I mean, this was actually, well, as we saw from this slide, like 80% of the system already, all of the new stuff is being built in the electricity system as renewables anyway. Very, very little coal still being built, and that coal which is being built is being used as backup. And the Chinese, for example, are now putting in place a capacity payment mechanism in order to allow these companies to survive, because they wouldn't survive otherwise, because they don't have enough flow going through them. So capacity utilization in Chinese coal is now below 50% and continuously falling.
So there's a question at the back. Yeah.
What are the implications for the carbon budget of the transition, and therefore for global warming? Because presumably if you do it very, very rapidly, you rely on fossil fuels. If you do it more slowly, perhaps you don't have to, but at the same time we're then burning fossil fuels for our energy requirements.
Well, I guess each new technology is built upon the shoulders of the previous one, which is why we measure oil in barrels, incidentally, because they were being used for beer in Pennsylvania in the 19th century. So it's absolutely normal to be using fossil fuels to build out the renewable system, and we should do that, and we should do it quickly. But to answer your question, look, the maths is really easy. But as I mentioned earlier, we have call it 300 gigaton. It's falling every year. We have a 300 gigaton budget, 40 per annum. It's 8 years to go to get to 1.5, and then in broad terms, every 180 gigatons is 0.1 degrees. So every 3 years, we're going to go up another 0.1 degrees. So if you want to get there, you're going to have to halve your fossil fuel demand quite quickly. I mean, you won't necessarily have to get down 40% by 2030 to be kind of on track for Paris, at least. But we do have to bend the curve down by the end of this decade.
The capital, if you like, the capital expenditure in carbon budget terms of the transition?
Oh, I see. Well, I tell you, the answer, World Bank's done the analysis of this, the answer is we would need, I think it's about 30 gigatons for the entire renewable system to be built out, and we're burning 40 gigatons per annum. So it's material, but it's not that much in the context of the system.
Thanks. We've got a couple of questions coming through on Slido, which I'm going to go to, just about the insurance industry. One, how rapidly do you see the insurance industry getting ahead of the curve? And allied to that, what influence does the insurance industry have on policy and private investment as the costs of global warming rise?
Well, I think one of the big problems being faced by the insurance, and in fact the whole finance system, is that it's still really, with all due respect, in denial about the impact of change. And I talked to all these folks in the insurance industry, and they think the answer is ticking boxes in ESG. And the argument that we make is, guys, you've got a tsunami of stranded assets coming your way, and you've got long-term assets. A $50 trillion fossil fuel system out there will be worthless within 30 years. Don't imagine that depreciation is going to do all the work for you. Someone is going to end up holding the baby and that system. And the insurance industry we would argue the insurance industry is facing very profound levels of risk. And so is pension
Does it
system.
face enough? Because a lot of the insurance industry reprices every year, so it kind of the pricing kind of sort of catches up with the action.
I'm thinking more on their asset side.
Right. Okay.
So where they're taking the money, if they're going and putting the money in long-term assets,
Yep.
and which are linked to the fossil fuel system, those assets are far riskier than they think they are.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, there's a series of new models, incidentally, coming out which will make this more apparent.
Great. Martin.
Kingsmill, thank you for firstly for cheering me up this morning and reminding me that maybe this is possible. I just want to look at the barriers for a second. One main thing I run into in numerous projects I'm involved in the UK with renewables is the infrastructure, it's the grid. And the grid was designed with none of this in mind. It's not fit for the purpose that we're trying to get it to. It can be changed. So now we come back to the question of capital allocation. We have a privatised grid that doesn't seem to know how to, doesn't want to go and fund this because it basically take on a huge amount of debt. We've got a government that, frankly, isn't interested in doing this and doesn't have any money to do it anyway. And for the individual projects, they look at it and go, well, it's not my problem to solve the entire grid. I just want a single connection, or I just want this bit of first mile. Do you have any thoughts, or have you done any research on, we're not the only country that faces the same problem. How do we get the investment into what is now a privatised system?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, this energy transition ain't going to be easy. There's a lot of stuff which needs to happen. I mean, the three things that have to happen and we have to get on with. It's grids, permitting and regulatory reform. Those are the three things we all have to do globally if we want this thing to work. There's no guarantee that any one country will succeed. And that's where I think this whole issue of geopolitical competition is highly relevant. If we fail, we fail, and other people will succeed. Do we want to fall behind our global competition? So it is a real issue, and what it does, it kind of puts, I think we need to put fire to the feet of the policymakers and those who are designing the systems in order to make the change happen. And to be clear, so the IEA, for example, talks about we're spending $300 billion a year or $320 billion a year globally on grids, and we need to go up to $600 billion, right? So we need to double it. And we're building 2.2 million kilometres per annum of grids globally, and we have to build 2.1. So I mean, it's hard, but it ain't that hard. And we have to recognise that we built grids from scratch after 1900, and now what do we have to do? We have to double the size in 10 years or something. Well, we just have to get on with it. So I'm not saying, and if your question is, do I have any solutions? It's very country specific. I mean, again, capital is not an impediment to the energy transition in any way. It's not just the G-Fens' kind of legendary 130 trillion. All we have to do is reallocate the money we're giving to fossil fuels, to renewables, and we'll be two-thirds of the way there. It's really not a capital issue. It's an opportunity issue, and it's a regulatory issue, and it's a belief issue.
Just building on that point about global competition, and just a question here on the Slido app. Will the Inflation Reduction Act in the US be enough for the US to catch up with China, and can American companies compete with China? And China's sort of been a big influence on this market and also on what's happened in the last year or two.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the IRA is amazing. They've got the US back in the game. And by the end of this decade, the US is on track to have enough solar and battery capacity to satisfy all of its domestic demands. And so it's been a very successful, as you said, piece of industrial policy to get the US back in the game. But actually, don't forget, it's not just the US. I mean, you've got the European Green New Deal, you've got stuff happening in China, India, and Korea, UK, of course. It's just kind of sparked people. It's woken people up to the reality of being dependent upon a single country, China.
for all of the technologies of the future.
Hugo.
Likewise, enjoyable presentation, Kingsmill. Has cheered me up a bit. Good to hear that capitalism might be part of the solution. One thing that sort of nags at me a little bit is on the solar front, which the whole value chain is dominated by China. Is that a concern for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, single country risk at a fragile moment means that we do need to build out our own non-Chinese infrastructure to make our own solar panels. And well, as I just mentioned, that's now, the IRA's stimulated that kind of supply chain reaction in the United States. And Europe is trying to do, incidentally, the kind of similar thing. So you don't need to replace China in its entirety, but you just need alternative options. And that's certainly coming. Europe, US, India, all trying to do this. And they, in their own sweet way, will succeed one way or another.
I wanted to pick up on you said I like the slide on your 4 levers of change with decarbonisation and electrification and hydrogenisation, which Seb's disputing whether that's a real word. But electrification and hydrogenisation, are they in competition with each other? They compete for share of voice? Can they both be a real part of the solution? Also in terms of more efficiency, I saw your state 1, state 2 graph.
Yeah.
It only really flattens out in terms of total energy demand. That never really comes down.
So primary energy demand does fall. And this is, again, I don't want to be like a textbook. Useful energy demand, the fossil fuel system is unbelievably inefficient. If you take the Lawrence Livermore stats, we're pouring 2/3 of our energy into the air for nothing. So, in fact, you can have a somewhat paradoxical situation where primary useful energy, that is about the energy that you and I use, can continue to rise, but primary energy falls. And that's where we're heading, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Absolutely inevitably, actually, with the speed with which renewables come into the system. And, but to answer your question about electrification versus hydrogen, look, as everyone says, hydrogen's the champagne of the energy system, right? It's the thing that you do if you can't find anything else. Right. So what will actually happen, I suspect, is that our entrepreneurs and scientists will figure out ways to electrify stuff. And to put some context on that, I mean, 10 years ago, this last piece, by the way, the contenders for the last piece are electricity, CCS, biomass, and hydrogen. 2 of those technologies, biomass and CCS, don't have a learning curve and are highly problematic and don't work. So we can just discard them for the long-term future, I would suggest. So it's going to be a fight between electrification and hydrogen, and may the best technology win. I mean, it kind of depends. But in 2023, it's not an interesting debate. 2023, we just have to get technologies of solar and wind, batteries and EVs, and just deploy them at scale and sort out our grids and make it work.
Thank you, Kingsmill. We're going to have to leave a couple of questions left on the Slido app, I'm afraid, to keep moderately on time and give everyone a break for coffee now. But it's long been an ambition to have you on the stage, and I'm sorry we did it in this way in such short notice, but it's been fantastic to have both yourself and Sir Alok this morning. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.